The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning. The subcommittee is convening today to review the state of the U.S. flag maritime industry, including the U.S. Merchant Marine. The Jones Act was enacted in 1920 as part of the Merchant Marine Act. It encouraged a strong merchant marine to support both national defense and economic security. For a vessel to move merchandise or passengers between 2 points in the United States, also called the coastwise trade, a vessel is required to be owned by a U.S. citizen, U.S. flag, built in the United States, and crewed with U.S. mariners. There are over 41,000 U.S. flag vessels in the U.S. coastwise trade, moving 115 million passengers and nearly $300 billion worth of goods between U.S. ports on an annual basis. The use of a U.S. flag built and crewed vessel in the domestic coastwide trade can be waived by the Secretary of Homeland Security in two ways under Section 501 of Title 46 United States Code. The first waiver authority outlined in subsection 501A is at the request of the Secretary of Defense for the purpose of national defense. The second outlined in subsection 501B is also for the purpose of national defense. However, MARAD is required to make a determination that no U.S. vessel is available. The subsection 501A waiver authority was used by the Secretary of Homeland Security for responses to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. U.S. industry raised concerns regarding the use of the waiver authority, as did we. Out of the over 41,000 U.S. flag vessels, there are only 82 vessels active in international commerce, down from 850 vessels 35 years ago. The United States has cargo preference requirements where a percentage of U.S. government cargo, including international food aid, be transported on U.S. flag vessels. One intention behind the requirement is to ensure a merchant marine, both vessels and mariners, remain available and capable to provide sealift capacity in times of conflict or national emergencies. Out of those 82 vessels, 60 vessels participate in the Maritime Security Program, which provides an annual stipend to military-useful ocean-going vessels to support military sealift operations. So without the MSP, we'd have 20 vessels that can operate without a stipend, basically. In order to maintain the capabilities necessary to assist military operations and continue to conduct coastwise trade operations, the U.S. flag fleet needs a strong, proficient pool of U.S. merchant mariners. Officials in the administration have reported to the committee that the active pool of U.S. merchant mariners is decreasing due to retirements and low recruitment rates. To work to address any potential gaps, members of this subcommittee support increasing the opportunities for military mariners to transition into civilian mariners. Mariners in the armed forces have skills that can successfully translate it into the civilian workforce. Military mariners just need to know about what civilian opportunities are available and how they can attain the proper certificates during their military career to successfully transition into a civilian career. The subcommittee held 2 listening sessions in 2016 that included military and civilian participants to discuss what needs to be done to create a more seamless process for military mariners to transition into a civilian mariner career. In addition, the Department of Defense reported that in 2016 and 2017, the Navy, Army, and Coast Guard participated in MERPAC meetings, conferences, and working groups to make further progress on this issue. I look forward to discussing where we are now and the importance of ensuring the United States has a strong, stable merchant marine. The civilian mariner workforce is facing a potential shortage of military mariners can be a way to bridge any gaps as well as provide an ongoing source of retired, experienced military mariners. I thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing their thoughts on the issues regarding the state of the U.S. flag maritime industry. And I will now yield to Ranking Member Garamendi. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your testimony and laying out the issues before us. It's been almost 3 years now since we last convened an oversight hearing, although we did have the listening sessions on the status of the U.S. maritime industry. Thank you very much for acting on my suggestion and scheduling this morning's hearing, as this is a perfect opportunity to assess where the industry stands and gather suggestions for issues that this subcommittee can take up in the second session of the 115th Congress. We already realize several items deserve our dedicated attention, but by no means do these items represent the entire universe of issues and challenges. First and foremost, we cannot become complacent in our defense of the Jones Act and our efforts, along with many other organizations, some of whom will be testifying this morning, to raise public awareness of the need for and the many benefits that flow from this longstanding maritime policy that has stood for nearly a century. Second, we need to address the need to find new cargoes for the U.S. flag vessels in both the international and coastwide trades. More cargo means more ships, and more ships mean more good-paying maritime jobs that both directly and indirectly support the hundreds of thousands of U.S. workers and bolster national security. And by the way, I've got some ideas on how we can do that. The export of oil and natural gas give us such an opportunity, but more about that later. To this end, we need better enforcement of the existing cargo preference requirements, especially for the fruit aid shipments. We need to utilize new trades, such as the export of crude oil and natural gas. We also need to look creatively at how best to recapitalize our nation's ready reserve, military sealift, and maritime security program fleets. In addition, if there's going to be an infrastructure bill this year, and I hope there is, we need to make sure that the infrastructure needs of our domestic maritime industries are not left behind at the dock. Moreover, we have to begin shaping a tractable plan to recruit and retain a new generation of licensed and unlicensed seafarers. The current cadre of mariners, which have served commerce and national security of the United States so admirably since the end of the Vietnam War, is quickly aging out along with the ships. It's imperative that the federal government, along with its partners in the state maritime academies and maritime unions, develop a comprehensive plan to ensure that the absence of qualified and experienced mariners in the workforce does not become an Achilles heel, limiting our military sealift operations and our national security. I'm sure that our witnesses here this morning will offer their own suggestions, and with that thought in mind, I welcome the witnesses and look forward to engaging in the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from California. We will have two panels of witnesses today. On the first panel, we will hear from Rear Admiral John Netto. Yeah, you like that? Got it right. Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy for the United States Coast Guard, and Rear Admiral Mark Buzz Busby, U.S. Navy retired, Administrator, Maritime Administration. Admiral Netto, you recognize to give your statement.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am honored to be here today to discuss the state of the U.S. maritime industry and the Coast Guard's role serving that industry. Mr. Chairman, on behalf of all the Coast Guard's men and women, thank you for your leadership and strong support of the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard offers enduring value to our nation. It is the only branch of the U.S. Armed Services within DHS and is uniquely positioned to secure our ports, protect the maritime transportation system, and safeguard America's national and economic security. As the Commandant has said, years of fiscal constraint and increasing mission demands have eroded our ability to fully execute our suite of missions and remain ready to effectively respond to all contingencies. We need to make investments to rebuild and sustain Coast Guard capability and capacity, including our marine safety programs. The nation's marine transportation system includes 25,000 miles of waterway traveled by several thousand vessels serving 361 U.S. ports every day. This system supports more than 250,000 American jobs and over $4.5 trillion of economic activity every year. This system connects Americans' consumers, producers, manufacturers, and farmers to domestic and global markets, and provides access to our nation's vast natural resources. The Coast Guard ensures this system remains safe, secure, and resilient. A strong U.S. maritime industry enables us to protect U.S. interests and project power overseas. 90% of the military equipment used by the nation's warfighters is loaded in U.S. ports and delivered to theater on Coast Guard-inspected U.S. flag vessels that are operated by Coast Guard licensed credentialed U.S. mariners. Our support to the maritime industry is critical to our nation's military readiness and national security. A robust population of U.S. mariners is needed to maintain an effective military sealift capability. The Coast Guard and industry are working together to mitigate challenges facing mariners today. Our advisory committees contain experienced merchant mariners, educators for the maritime academies, and industry representatives. They help us identify strategies to address challenges as they emerge. Congress clearly recognizes the importance of having a sufficient number of qualified mariners. DoD and DHS are working together to implement the Military to Mariner program and make it easier for military members to receive credit for experience, training, and qualification received while in the military. We've partnered with the Navy to establish a credentialing program and improved military member awareness of civilian mariner opportunities. We've cut through red tape, and we continue to work closely with our fellow armed services to make improvements to this program. We know a healthy mariner workforce requires a safe, secure, and competitive U.S. maritime fleet. The industry faces a number of challenges beyond those of the workforce, including an aging population of strategic sealift vessels. At the same time, the complexity and pace of change in the industry have never been greater. Industry is integrating new technology into vessels and facilities to improve efficiency and effectiveness, to increase capacity, and to reduce the environmental footprint. This activity is making ships, facilities, and ports, and the entire system more complex. The use of third parties has helped industry and the Coast Guard evolve to keep pace with these changes. Today, like other flag states around the globe, the U.S. relies far more on third parties than ever before. The vast majority of vessels in our Sealift fleet use third parties for many of their compliance activities, and third-party programs have gone from an option to a necessity. The benefits of third parties are well documented. A study by the National Academy of Science that was directed by the subcommittee and published in 2016 concluded that our third-party programs provide additional technical expertise, promote innovation, and reduce cost for the U.S. fleet. However, third-party programs are not infallible. Third-party programs require effective Coast Guard oversight and clear accountability to realize these benefits. The Coast Guard has the authority and competency we need. We will instill better governance, we'll improve our policy and training, and we'll provide increased accountability, while also supporting a safe, secure, and competitive U.S. fleet. In closing, a healthy U.S. maritime industry and a robust pool of civilian mariners are vital to our nation's economic prosperity and national security. The Coast Guard's regulatory, credentialing, and compliance programs are evolving to keep pace with industry change. We're focused on ensuring every one of our actions sustains a safe, secure, environmentally sound, and productive operation of the marine transportation system without imposing unnecessary costs or burdens. Mr. Chairman, we thank you for the subcommittee for your strong leadership and support of the Coast Guard. I ask that my written statement be entered into the record. Thank you.
Without objection. Thank you, Admiral. Admiral, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss the state of the U.S. maritime industry and the Maritime Administration's programs that support it. Our country's military relies on U.S. flagged ships crewed by volunteered American civilian mariners to move our combat forces equipment and sustainment wherever and wherever it needs to go. 3/4 of MARAD's budget goes to programs that help to ensure that America has a viable commercial merchant marine, one with enough ships and enough qualified merchant mariners to meet our needs in peacetime and, critically, our emergency sealift during times of crisis. Unfortunately, over the past few decades, the U.S. maritime industry has suffered significant losses as companies, ships, and jobs moved overseas. Cargo is one of the main factors determining the number of ships in the U.S. flagged fleet. Since 1992, the number of U.S. flagged ships has dropped from 183 ships to 82 now. This leaves us at the lowest number in the deep sea fleet in recent history. That has, in turn, contributed to a loss of jobs available to U.S. citizen mariners in international trade. Today, due to the historically low number of ships, MARAD is concerned that there might not be enough qualified mariners to sustain a prolonged activation of the Sealift fleet. I'm working closely with U.S. Transcom, the U.S. Navy's Military Sealift Command, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the commercial maritime industry to develop plans to maintain an adequate number of trained mariners. This coordinated effort includes advancing the military to mariner initiative, making it easier for transitioning veterans to obtain their mariner credentials based on their service experience. That is, however, only a small part of the solution. To reverse this trajectory, my initial priorities as Maritime Administrator have been to leverage the current mainstays of the Merchant Marine, the Jones Act, Cargo Preference, and the Maritime Security Program, and to rethink how we address long-term strategic issues facing the industry. The Jones Act ensures a U.S. flagged fleet in domestic trade by requiring American-built, owned, and crewed vessels to transport passengers and cargo between U.S. ports. Cargo preference laws, which require shippers to use U.S. flagged vessels for ocean-borne transport of certain cargoes purchased with federal funds, help ensure that the U.S. flagged fleet has enough cargo to remain viable in international trade. The Maritime Security Program, which supports 60 militarily useful commercial vessels and their crews, along with a global network of intermodal facilities, provides funding to help offset the higher costs operating under the U.S. flag. Continuing, strengthening, and adding to these three pillars, the Jones Act, cargo preference, and the MSP, is essential for maintaining the economic competitiveness, safety, and productivity of the U.S. maritime transportation system. They bolster the U.S. flag fleet's ability to support the national and economic security needs of the nation. MARAD provides funding support for mariner training programs at our nation's flagship maritime training facility and my proud alma mater, Kings Point, as well as the 6 state maritime academies across the nation. Virtually all entry-level officers with unlimited U.S. Coast Guard licenses graduate from these schools. These merchant mariners support the peacetime U.S. maritime transportation infrastructure and serve our nation during military operations worldwide and national emergencies and humanitarian crisis. Part of our assistance to the 6 state maritime academies comes in the form of training ships, 2 of which are more than 50 years old. MARAD also manages and maintains the bulk of our nation's surge sealift capacity found in the Ready Reserve Fleet. These 46 ships with an average age of 43 years are well past their design service life. MARAD is working with the U.S. Transportation Command and the U.S. Navy to determine how to best recapitalize the RRF to ensure the continued readiness of these vessels. That is a brief overview of the priority action items that I am involved in at MARAD. I appreciate the subcommittee's continuing support for maritime programs and will be happy to respond to any questions you and the members of the subcommittee may have this morning. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record. Thank you, sir.
Without objection, thank you, Admiral. And Admiral, I'll start by recognizing myself. So let's play this out and set the scenario. So let's say that country X goes off and it's a real war, not counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, and you got to bring a bunch of stuff really fast. Lay it out for us right now. What would move and what wouldn't move? What is your guess on how many guys, how many ships out of the RRF we can actually get up and going? How would that look? Right now.
As we speak, as of this morning, the Ready Reserve Force readiness was at 98%, which means that our metrics that we use to measure how ready those ships are to activate.
So don't let me. So let's break it down into a real scenario. You told me you're doing a test right now.
Correct.
You're doing a call up on one of the biggest Ready Reserve ships that you have. They have 5 days.
4 of them, actually. Right.
4 of them, and they have 5 days to prep.
Correct.
Your 98% is not coming from that. So if you were to just guess and say in your mind, how many of your ships could you get underway, loaded to the brim with ammo, food, supplies, and everything that you need? You could get 98% of the Ready Reserve Fleet right now moving?
Within the 5-day period, yes, sir. I have good confidence that, as I said, 98% of those we would be able within the 5-day period to light off, crew up, and provision.
When does that fall off and we start losing that capacity? Meaning if we don't do anything, you have steam engine Ready Reserve ships.
Right.
You have mariners that don't know how to work steam engines anymore or parts. So you're at 98%, which is awesome. But at some point, I'm guessing it goes to 95, 90, 85,
Sure.
Right?
Yes, sir.
When does that drop-off happen?
It's without funding commensurate with the age of those ships as they become more difficult to maintain. I'd say we could start seeing that happen at any time going forward. Okay. You know, as I said, these ships are 43 years old. 24 of them will be 50 years old here by 2020. And each year that an old ship gets older, it becomes more challenging to maintain, and we won't be able to guarantee that readiness.
How long does it take to figure out whether a ship can be fixed up or whether you just have to build a new one and scrap it? That analysis.
Actually going on board and doing the site surveys and kicking the steel and that sort of thing. You know, to do an entire survey of the fleet, we're constantly doing that, but I would say to do a real focus survey, probably several months to really go through.
And you're going to be doing that?
We're doing it constantly because that's part of our recapitalization effort, is to look and see what ships potentially have further.
You'll be able to come back to us in 6 months or 4 months and say, these are how many ships we need to build, these are how many ships we can fix up.
Conceivably, we could, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let me switch really quick. I got 2 minutes. Let's talk people. Let's talk first, Admiral Neto. when it comes, we've talked a lot, and it was Navy in the beginning that had the big issue from transferring a mariner's occupational specialty and certifications over to the civilian world, right? The Navy had a lot of issues with that. The Army was actually pretty good at it. How's it going with the Coast Guard?
Sir, we've made a lot of progress as well. The Coast Guard has.
Do you mind pulling the microphone closer to you? I've got
Sir.
artillery ears.
That better? That better? Coast Guard has two pieces to this. One is providing experienced military members that can apply the skill sets and the training to merchant credentials. We also have, of course, a credentialing program. We are the ones that issue those credentials. Working with MERPAC and others, and our partners in DOD and in DOT, we have come up with about 88 some odd recommendations that we've been working to implement. And we've made significant progress. Around this time, we've approved about 200 different courses that from different services. The Coast Guard has about 60 some odd of those are Coast Guard courses that allow the members to take, again, their direct training they've had while in uniform and apply that to attaining a merchant mariner credential.
So you're helping the Navy walk through this too?
Yes, sir. We've developed a crosswalk that allows members to look, again, at their training and their qualifications in the service and how they can apply that directly to merchant mariner credentials.
What is MARAD doing on the same line?
Mr. Chairman, I co-chair a committee, a subcommittee of the Committee on Maritime Transportation System, along with Commander of Military Sealift Command, to look at which has members of all of the sea services, NOAA, Army Corps of Engineers, anybody that has mariners, government mariners, to see identify what are the impediments, what are the roadblocks to keeping those folks from transitioning cleanly using the Coast Guard certified courses into the commercial maritime. We've identified a lot of roadblocks, and that's actually a fairly active committee that's producing some good results.
Good. Look forward to hearing about it. I've got one last question, if the members will indulge me. You have about 40,000 ships that are doing not coastwise trade, but inland waterways trade, mostly.
Jones Act trade, yes, sir.
Admiral Neto, you're the head of prevention policy, right?
Correct.
So I would guess that means preventing bad guys from doing bad things, too, on the waters. All 40,000 of those ships have been approved by the U.S. Coast Guard, right? For them, I mean, they've passed their certifications. They're crewed by Americans, and they're American-made ships. So you got American-crewed, Coast Guard-approved crews and ships operating on the rivers throughout all the ports in the entire country. In your professional opinion, as a military man, both of you, would you like to see foreign ships in the inland waterways? Chinese, Pakistani, name it.
Sir, I'd say that you're absolutely right. Right now, under current laws and regulations, all of those ships are U.S. built, operated by a U.S. licensed, U.S.
From a Homeland Security point of view, how important it is to you that you have U.S. crewed, Coast Guard certified ships and crews operating where there is no oversight, where you're going into middle America with thousands of ships every day carrying chemicals, all kinds of cargo. How important it is to you and Homeland Security?
Security is very important, sir, and you're right. That would be a different paradigm should that not all be U.S. mariners, U.S. citizens on board those ships.
So you've hit the nail on the head. Those mariners are a layer, a de facto layer of our national security. If they see something, they will say something. They know what's normal on the waterways.
The Jones Act maintains it.
And the
nobody
Jones
else
Act
can.
makes that possible.
Absolutely.
Period.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, let's start with Russia. There's a legislation passed by the Russian parliament that requires that all ships transiting the northern sea route, that is along the 4,000 miles of the Russian territory, be Russian flagged with a small exemption. Is that a Russian Jones Act? Either of the two of you would like to respond? And if so, does this also indicate that our own northern sea route should have a similar program?
I'll take a crack at that first. Like about 44 other countries around the world that have cabotage-type laws, this from at least my knowledge of what the Russian proposal is, sounds like a cabotage-type law, which for all the various same reasons why we want to have a Jones Act and think a Jones Act is important.
Now, the United States is now an exporter of LNG and oil. Should we not, would it be in the American interest in creating cargo to have some percentage of that export of LNG and oil be on American flagged and American built ships? Would that create a cargo opportunity for the American maritime industry?
Yes, sir. I think it would. You know, cargo is king, as we have said, and as you have all pointed out. What generates cargo generates ships and therefore generates jobs. So, you know, where we can generate cargo in international trade, that would be ultimately likely to the benefit of our industry.
And that now brings me to the issue of cargo preference enforcement, which is a MARAD program, to some extent also the Coast Guard. The 2008 NDAA directed MARAD to promulgate regulations to strengthen its enforcement of cargo preference requirements. Since then, MARAD has been unable to clear a proposal through the OMB office. Admiral Busby,
Sir.
you're new at this. Are you going to give it another shot? And are you capable of overcoming OMB with our help?
That's a good question, sir, which we'll have to kind of see how that plays out.
Let the last question go, but the first question, are
Yeah,
you ready to proceed?
Sure. The first part, sir, my cargo preference office actually is very heavily engaged on both sides, both with shippers and with the government agencies that ship cargo preference cargo. And we are working with them actually pretty well to ensure that currently the 50% cargo preference requirement is being met. And where it's not specifically being met for a particular cargo, we are doing what I would call catch-up procedures, where if it's through the non-availability of a U.S. flag ship to carry a particular cargo, we can make an exception to allow that cargo to go on a foreign flag ship. However, another cargo that's being shipped by that agency that maybe not required to be cargo preference, that gets made to be cargo preference, so it catches up and fulfills the requirement.
Well, the cargo preference laws are more than just food aid. They're also material goods that have been financed by the federal government. So it's a very broad array of things.
Yes, sir.
The more active and the more aggressive you are in investigating, quantifying, and reporting on these cargo opportunities and missed opportunities, the more likely it is that we will develop the cargo. If you're not willing to do that, and if you're not active, and I hope you would be very, very aggressive at this, it will move us towards more cargo rather than less. So we will, I hope, and certainly I think the chairman would agree with this, we'll hold you accountable for your efforts and for your activity in investigating, quantifying, and fully developing the information about all cargo that is impelled on American ships. You ready
Yes, sir.
for that?
Absolutely, sir.
Good. I want to go to the issue of the Outer Continental Shelf. Admiral Nadeau, I want to talk to you about your B-1 visas. This is going to be a subject from the second panel, but since you won't be around after the second panel or for it, let's get into it. The Coast Guard issues B-1 visas for foreign mariners to operate on either American or foreign ships providing services in the Outer Continental Shelf. How many visas have you issued?
Sir, I think that the Coast Guard issues a letter of non-availability to the vessels. We don't actually issue the visas. So we do issue letters of non-availability to foreign flag vessels that are majority foreign owned under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, OXLA. There are provisions in
The
there. where they
visas
could be-
start with your letter, don't they?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, then how many letters?
I would have to take that back to get you exact numbers. I wouldn't want to make an estimate here. We deal with those routinely. They come in, they're evaluated, we issue them, and then if there's a change in ownership or change in operations, those operators are supposed to come back to us to have them reevaluated. But I
When
take
can you
that-
get the information for me?
I would hope we have good records, sir, but it'd be as soon as
This
possible.
afternoon?
I'll do my best.
Good. You're aware that about half of the vessels that provide services to the Outer Continental Shelf or the and inner shelf are laid up?
Yes, sir, that's correct. We met with OMSA last week, and they provided us an update.
Do you have information on the number of foreign of ships that are that have foreign mariners rather than American mariners of those? So if half of the fleet is laid up, why? Is it foreign competition?
At this time, sir, my understanding is it's more because there's not as much activity in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay.
So if we're talking strictly a Gulf of Mexico, my understanding is that at the U.S. fleet, a lot of those vessels are tied up, but I wouldn't have any statistics for the global fleet.
I noticed my colleague down the dais here wants to jump in on this. So I guess you're going to be next. And I would appreciate you jumping in and carrying on this discussion. It's a big issue because it not only affects the mariners, but it affects the entire entire workforce and the ships. And I think part of the problem is created by the Coast Guard with your letters. We want to get into this in detail. When you issue a letter, do you also investigate whether the individual that is working on these ships is qualified?
Sir, again, we issue a letter to the vessel, and then that allows them to go out and find qualified people that meet whatever standards you're trying to fulfill. So there's
Do you then investigate whether the jobs that are being made available are filled by qualified foreign nationals?
foreign flag vessels are subject to the manning as specified by the flag that they fly. Just like U.S. vessels, we determine the manning. To the state, we have to make sure they meet SCCW, but for a lot of jobs in question, they're back deck where they have specialized skill sets.
So we may have foreign mariners operating in the Outer Continental Shelf and the inner that may or may not be qualified under U.S. law. Is that the case?
So I'd say U.S. law provides us to issue those exemptions, which we issue to the vessel. Then it is the Department of State that issues the visa to the actual crew member, and then CBP handles the entry process as they come into the
But
state.
my question goes to the qualifications of the mariner. Now, if they're American ships and American mariners, they have to meet a certain qualification, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Do these foreign nationals operating within the, providing these services,
They
do
would
they meet the same qualifications?
probably SCCW, the International Convention.
They do.
Yes, sir, for a foreign
Who's
ship,
responsible for checking whether they do or do not?
the foreign flag, if they're a foreign flag ship, that nation sets the manning and handles the licensing for those.
So you don't know whether they are qualified or not?
As part of our routine port state control boardings, we do go on board and we check the license certificates and documentation of all members on board the
We'll
ship.
go into this in more detail. Unfortunately, you will not be here after we hear from other witnesses. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Graves is recognized.
Thank you, Admirals. Appreciate you being here today. And I want to start on the line of Mr. Garamendi's line of questioning, which I think is excellent. Admiral Nadeau, excuse me. Do you know how many countries you've issued letters to under the waiver program under the B-1?
So I think we issue them to the vessel.
Right.
So how many?
I'm sorry,
different
yeah,
flags?
the flag of those nations.
Off the top of my head, I do not, sir. We'll have to try and get
Do you know if there are any vessels that are flagged from nations that would be considered perhaps unfriendly to the United States that are operating in the OCS?
unfriendly, like North Korea or Venezuela.
Take your pick.
I really doubt that, but I can provide those numbers for you, or do my best to get those answers.
If we had a submarine, a Russian sub sitting off the coast, a few miles off our coast, would that concern you?
Absolutely.
Do you think it's possible that some of these vessels perhaps are out there doing intelligence collecting and other things under the auspices of operating in our OCS?
I guess it's possible.
It's possible. Admiral, just last week I had a meeting with a number of constituents, in fact, this week, a number of constituents, in fact, probably over 100 of them, expressing concern over the H-2B visa program, a program whereby if you're unable to demonstrate, if you're unable to get domestic workforce, you can bring in foreign workforce to address surge capacity in different industries. It has to be a temporary basis. You have to demonstrate there's not American workforce available. In this case, it is clear, and I want to follow on the question that Mr. Garamendi asked, it is clear that there is additional work in the OCS that American-built ships, American-crewed, American-built, American-flagged ships could be doing. Otherwise, the foreign vessels wouldn't be there, of course. So there are numerous vessels tied up at Port Fourchon and a number of other ports along the Gulf Coast that could be doing this work. So I want to be very clear that there is a strong sensitivity on our part, and I think I speak for many members of this committee, that the perhaps lackadaisical enforcement by our federal government, and I know there are other agencies involved, is having an impact on American workforce, on American investment, and most importantly, just on families, on families right here in the United States. I think that every person I know in South Louisiana knows someone or has personally been impacted or laid off or lost their jobs in these industries. And so to watch these foreign vessels come in is especially concerning. Admiral, the CBP has admitted a lack of enforcement in the OCS, has admitted violations and lack of enforcement. What is the Coast Guard's position there? I mean, do you think that it is appropriate to have some of these foreign vessels operating just miles off our coast when we have domestic vessels that are capable of doing this same work in compliance with the law?
So we try to apply the laws and regulations as they're given to us and try to establish a level playing field. There is tension between the citizenship and under OXLA and with the U.S. flag and trying to provide a competitive fleet. We are in discussions about this with OMSA. We had a discussion about it last week. We look forward to working with industry to try and resolve some of that. But we know we have an extremely capable U.S. fleet. Over the past few years, there's some amazing vessels that have been built down the Gulf of Mexico that can do amazing things. We're committed to working with industry, with Congress, to try and find out how we can best employ those vessels to serve the nation.
Well, I want to urge you to do so with some urgency. As you know better than I, this isn't just about employment and economy. This is national security implications when this snowballs, as you well know. And I think it's important that we do keep this on the front burner. Change gears. Admiral Busby, were you consulted whenever the administration proposed to waive the Jones Act for some of the hurricane response activities?
No, sir.
You were not. Now, that's not required under the law, as I recall, but I think it...
Not under the 501A statute, which was used to grant those waivers. There were some other waivers that were discussed earlier in support of Hurricane Harvey that went through the 501B process that MARAD was consulted in, and our role in that process is to provide CBP with a list of vessels that could be U.S. flag vessels that could be available to meet the needs that the waiver is being requested for.
As I recall, there were one or two vessels perhaps that took advantage of those waivers. And when I went down to Puerto Rico with Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member DeFazio, and others, it was clear to me after seeing it myself, after talking to folks, that the real challenge was the internal infrastructure, perhaps distribution system within Puerto Rico that was significantly damaged rather than actually getting the cargo there. In fact, the ports were clogged with cargo. Is that a fair assessment?
That is my understanding of the situation, yes, sir. From talking with all of the Jones Act shippers, and I talked with all of them, they could not push any more cargo into the ports, or literally could not get it outside the gates.
So strong concern that we waived a law, and again, I think it was a solution searching for a problem, and I think that in many hearings that we've had in this committee and roundtables we've had in this committee that issues come up, and certainly understand that there are a lot of considerations at play when something like that happens. I certainly would request that you weigh in and share your expertise in this area in the event that something like this happens in the future. We're going to continue to be working to perhaps legislate a little bit more, a little bit better approach perhaps to disasters in the future. Last question. Admiral Nadeau, if you go back and you look at the FRC, the OPC, and other programs that you're running, that the Coast Guard's running right now, did you have just one shipyard that bid for some of these boats?
I'm not on the acquisition professional, but no, I believe there were multiple yards that competed for that work.
And I understand that it's not your program specifically, but certainly I think these are things that most folks, and certainly I think you would have some awareness of. The yards that are building some of these boats, do these boats only do government work?
The shipyards we're currently using, no, sir, they also do government, I'm sorry, they also do private commercial work.
Do you appreciate the role that the Jones Act plays in terms of ensuring we have a DIB, we have an industrial base here to ensure that we can build these vessels, that we can build the latest technology, that we can build the safest, most modern vessels available for our coasties? That relationship between the Jones Act, for example, if you're a pilot and we said, hey, we need you to come fly a plane once every 10 years, my guess is you're going to say, well, you know what, I really need to have some type of gap training and apply in this case. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. We do rely on the same yards that use commercial work, that we benefit from that tremendously.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I apologize for going over. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Larson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Busby, I just have a couple questions. They're both for you.
Sure.
So the President and the administration has ran on, then announced, and rumors are flying as we sit here today, that a $1 trillion infrastructure package will find its way up here to the Hill, at least principles for a package. And part of infrastructure ought to be supporting the U.S. maritime industry. So my question is for you, and if MARAD itself has been consulted or part of that conversation within the administration on what parts of that infrastructure package would best serve maritime, and if so, what parts?
Thank you, sir. Answer to your question, short answer is yes, we have been involved within Secretary of Transportation's office. We have been working very closely with her staff, who have obviously then inputted into the national strategy. We've made a very strong point that our ports are our gateways to our economy. I mean, virtually everything in our economy flows through our ports, our key gateway ports, and then all of our smaller feeder ports really is where the majority of this nation's commerce gets done. And the importance of those ports and the connections from those ports via highway, via rail, via adjacent airports, and via the waterways that we spoke of earlier, using Jones Act vessels to move that cargo intercoastal throughout our country, are all very, very vital and need further investment if we want to keep pace with our growth to keep the flow moving.
That's great. So perhaps you can't share with us, but are there specific elements that you at MARAD brought to that discussion?
We thought that the Maritime Highway initiatives was very important. That's, in our opinion, kind of an underutilized mode of transport in our country that could significantly impact the highway congestion by removing a lot of containers that are moved around this country off of there, where it makes sense to, where it economically makes sense. And we have several operating marine highways in this country right now that are doing just that, cuts down on pollution. Instead of having a whole lot of diesel engines moving things, you have one diesel engine moving cargo around. So we think there's great benefit there.
All right. Let me ask about one particular program. It's been around since 2008 or so, it's Small Shipyard Grant Program. Do you anticipate this year that you will be tendering grant applications for small shipyard grants? And do you know yet how much MARAD will have to allocate for that?
I haven't seen any of the final numbers. I expect that the program will continue to exist and be utilized. It's a very popular program. We get roughly about 10 times the amount of requests for grants than we actually can submit. They're typically small amounts of money, but they have big impact across the maritime industry, typically in the maintenance and repair area, that are very critical to maintaining the Coast Guard's vessels, Ready Reserve Force vessels, military Sealift Command vessels. We all benefit from investments in these small.
I'm glad to hear that. In its early life, once it got started, it did have some struggles staying alive, but members of this committee have been very strong advocates of the program, of the Small Shipyard Grant Program. So it's glad to see the allocation last year and hope to see continued support from this administration for that. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Weber is recognized.
Thank you. That was a great exchange between Congressman Garamendi about the B-1 visas. And so Admiral Nadeau, am I saying that right? My question is, and you may not know the specifics, but have there been instances where sailors, foreigners on those vessels, I know you said you issue certificates to the vessel, but are there any reported instances where we have discovered sailors that were not qualified?
Not to my knowledge on the OCS. No.
Okay, fair enough. So I think one of the comments that was made earlier is about the Jones Act and vessels up in the waterways from the chairman, which I'm all about, being sure that we keep the Jones Act in place and be sure that we protect the integrity of our country. Have there been any incidents, Admiral, I'm still with you, where there has been discovered on the interior waterways? I mean, I don't know how it would happen, so I'm just asking you, foreign flagged vessels or sailors that were not qualified?
Again, not to my knowledge. Those vessels, and there are thousands of them, are manned, crewed by U.S. citizens that are credentialed by the Coast Guard.
How many thousands would you estimate?
On the Heartland, that's hard to estimate. I can tell you, sir, that we're embarking right now on implementing Subchapter M, which includes about 5,500 different vessels.
Okay.
But then you got to add other vessels, not just towboats, but there are many other types of vessels, from passenger ferries. But it's got to be well more than 5,000, probably closer to 7,000.
What's your biggest challenge around the country? Is it the deep water ports on the west? Is it the Gulf of Mexico? Where would you say most of your time, your agency's time, is spent?
Well, we're distributed across the United States, and I think that workload is, again, we see it was a lot of activity in the Gulf Coast. Some of that has shifted, certainly throughout the Heartland, throughout the marine transportation system, the 25,000 miles of rivers and those 360 ports. It is distributed across the country, sir. So it's hard to say there's one particular area that's more important than another. We have people.
Well, I didn't say important, I said activity. I chose my words carefully.
Yes, sir. I would hesitate to say it depends on the activity, because we're doing many different functions and missions, whether that's vessel inspection, whether that is, again, the licensing manning functions, the investigations piece of this, the port security piece. There's a lot of different activities served by the Coast Guard across the entire nation.
Is there a particular product, whether it's container or bulk or whether it's tank vessels, is there a particular product that presents the most problem to y'all?
I wouldn't say there's one that presents a problem. We establish a regulatory regime to address the challenges, and we have a risk-based, performance-based regime in place to help make sure that we monitor and address whatever challenges those might be.
Going to the Gulf Coast, Hurricane Harvey, which you guys did a fabulous job, by the way. I have the first 3 coastal counties of Texas, starting at Louisiana, that other foreign country, and it's Jefferson County, Galveston County, and southern half of Missouri County. Were y'all well prepared for Hurricane Harvey and that kind of response, or is there something we could have done better?
Sir, again, a little bit outside my wheelhouse, but through talking with my peers, I mean, we're always looking to improve. I thank you for the compliments to our fabulous crew we had down there. We're very proud of them. But we always look to improve, so we will be going through an after-action process to make sure that we can improve.
Fair enough. Yeah, I appreciate that. Admiral Busby, I'm going to jump over to you now. In some of the earlier questions, you weren't consulted by the administration over the waiver of the Jones Act, you said.
It's not required that the MARAD be, no, sir.
Well, I get that, but we would have appreciated that, right? Is there a way, a method or mechanism, or I don't know what you want to call it, an avenue where in the future going forward, maybe you could establish that and say, hey, look, you know, guys, going forward, we'd appreciate if, you know, maybe you might want to check with us. Have you thought about an avenue for that?
Well, short of changing the statute, there would be no legal precedent for that.
I get that.
Certainly, there is, you know, informal liaison that can go on, and we had heard that some of that was occurring.
You didn't hear it through Twitter, did you?
No, sir.
I'm just asking.
I don't tweet.
Okay. You're a smart man. All right. And Admiral, I'll stay with you for just a minute. What is, your opinion, what is the greatest hindrance that we currently face to keeping the Jones Act in place and making sure that it does well for our country? What's the greatest hindrance?
I think it's probably a misunderstanding by many of exactly the critical role that the Jones Act plays. A lot of people, I think, focus on strictly an economic view of the impact of the Jones Act and fail to recognize the significance to national security.
Well, I would submit that if we don't have a good economy, then our national security is going to lag behind.
Right, and by economy, you know, it's I mean the costs
Sure.
associated with the Jones Act that people allege that adds to the cost.
Let me jump over. I'm a little bit out of time to you, Admiral. What's the greatest asset that we have that's helping us with the Jones Act? What's the best thing in place? I'm going to do the opposite of what I asked him. What's the greatest hindrance? Now, to you, what's the greatest thing we have making sure that we preserve the Jones Act?
That's a tough one, sir. Again, the Jones Act has been in place for nearly 100 years, and we see many benefits and many impacts. Many impacts. Should one look to perhaps unwind some of that, we have to be mindful of the second, third order effects. But we see tremendous benefit to the Jones Act in terms of safety, the quality, the mariners, our industrial base, and we would just offer that.
I'm going to come back full circle, and that's why I was questioning earlier about have we caught any sailors that weren't qualified on foreign flag vessels, because that would serve as a basis for us to say, look, we want to keep the Jones Act in place and make sure that we've got American vessels, make sure that we're doing our job, it's helping our economy, and it's helping our national security. So maybe it's education, you guys helping educate?
Yes, sir. Coming back to your question about mariners, I was answering directly for the Gulf of Mexico, but we do, as part of our port state control boardings, when we go on foreign vessels, we do assess the competency of the foreign crew members, and we do, on occasion, find that they're not meeting the international standards.
So what happens with that vessel that you've issued a certificate or a letter to when they have someone on board that doesn't qualify?
We intervene on the international convention and ensure that appropriate steps are taken to correct the deficiencies, whatever they might be.
Does that vessel lose its ability to come back into our area?
They must take corrective action to bring it to the proper level of safety before they're allowed to operate.
And who follows up on that?
The Coast Guard.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Great questions. I think that's it for this panel. No further questions. Mr. Garamendi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity for an additional question. We went round and round on this issue of foreign vessels operating in the Outer Continental Shelf. It seems to me that the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act is very, very clear that it is a Jones Act region. Is there any doubt about that?
We have many foreign vessels with foreign manners that are permitted to work on the Outer Continental Shelf, sir.
So there is doubt as to whether or not the Outer Continental Shelf is subject to the Jones Act?
It is subject to the Jones Act if it are moving cargo that is subject to Jones Act. But a vessel that is just working out on the Outer Continental Shelf that is not transferring cargo can go out and work on the shelf.
Yeah, we're going to go into this a little more in the second panel, I'm sure. But I want to just ask the question about letter of non-availability. That's issued by the Coast Guard?
Yes,
Is
sir.
there a time frame in which that letter of non-availability is applicable? Or is it just available and then goes on for an unlimited period of time?
Unless the circumstances change, it is issued to the vessel based on the ownership of the vessel and the flag of the vessel. If those conditions don't change, the letter remains in effect.
Okay, so you issue a letter of non-availability authorizing a foreign flagged vessel to operate on the Outer Continental Shelf, correct?
Yes, sir. It allows them to use foreign
Okay.
workers.
And now we have a situation where some 50% of the American vessels that would provide services in the Outer Continental Shelf are laid up. Is there a non-availability today?
Is your question, are there vessels that are applying for non-availability, letters of non-availability today?
Wouldn't it be appropriate that since half of the American vessels are laid up, that there is no question of availability, and therefore the letters of non-availability should terminate?
So we're applying OXLA and the domestic law and statutes as they're presented to us, trying to enhance a level and fair playing field. But there are some tensions between, again, the citizenship and trying to make sure we recognize that in OXLA, and then trying to keep our fleet competitive. There is some tension there.
Okay.
I'd be happy to come back and get a more detailed brief for you, though, sir.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, just closing here, I think you heard from quite a few members. We've seen the crew list of some of these ships where you have Moldovans, Chechens, Kazakhs, got all kinds of people on these ships, and you don't know who they are. You don't know who they are, which means Homeland Security doesn't know who they are, which means the U.S. government and the American people don't know who they are either. It could be great guys, it could be bad guys. You don't know because you issue that letter to the ship and say, you got to comply now. And if they're a bad actor, they're not going to comply, but they don't have to worry about it because you don't check their crews. And if you have Americans able to do it right now, and you're having Moldovans and Kazakhs and Chechens out there, you don't know who's out there on a Norwegian ship. You got a Norwegian captain, a Norwegian mate, first mate or whatever chief, then you could have whoever. And we would like to know who is manning those ships. And at the same time, we're curious as to why you're allowing them at all when you have U.S. ships able to do it. So at least make it more stringent on them so you have to say, hey, you've got a terrorist on your ship. That's maybe bad, right? So with that, there are no more questions. Rear Admirals, thank you very much for your time and your expertise and for being with us today. And with that, we're going to move on to the second panel. Appreciate it. All right, panel 2A. We're now going to hear from Mr. Matt Woodruff, Chairman of the Board of Directors, American Maritime Partnership, Mr. Eric Ebeling, President and CEO of American Roll-Off Carrier, on behalf of USA Maritime, Mr. Aaron Smith, President and Chief Executive Officer, Offshore Marine Services Association, Mr. Matthew Paxton, President, Shipbuilders Council of America, and Mr. Bill Van Loo, Secretary Treasurer for the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association. And on behalf of American Maritime Officers, Masters, Mates, and Pilots, and the Seafarers International Union, great to see you all here. Thank you for being here. And Mr. Woodruff, you're now recognized to give your statement.
Turn on your mic.
Absolutely, sorry. AMP is the largest maritime trade association in America, representing vessel owners and operators, shipbuilders and repair yards, dredging, marine construction contractors, trade associations, pro-defense groups, and more. And I'd say that on balance, the state of our industry is good. There are bright spots, yet there are also very significant causes for concern. There's been a massive recapitalization in our industry of late, and in some segments, that process is ongoing. Billions have been invested. We have new tank, container, offshore service vessels, dredges, towboats, and tugboats built at shipyards all around America, sailing all around America. Our business tends to run in cycles, and many segments of the domestic industry have been in a down cycle for some time. So as I talk about the positive aspects of our industry, we shouldn't forget that for many of our companies right now, even entire segments of our industry, they're having a really hard time right now. Despite our challenges, our industry continues to serve its customers well with vessels that are purpose-built for the needs of our markets. The foundation of everything we do is the Jones Act. It exists to protect America by enhancing our economic, national, and homeland security. America needs the benefits provided by the Jones Act as much today as it ever has. Our industry needs certainty as we invest in long-life assets, and we know we'll never get that certainty from the marketplace, but we need regulatory certainty from our government. We need the Jones Act to remain the settled law of the land. Hurricanes were a big issue for us in the past year, and our people rose to the challenge. They implemented their hurricane plans, they rode out the storms with remarkably little damage, and when the rain stopped falling and the wind stopped blowing, they got back to doing what they do best, moving cargo for America, dredging channels impacted by the storms, serving the offshore oil and gas industry. In many cases, the people of our industry put aside the damage to their own homes because they knew that the cargo they carried represented a lifeline to the affected communities. Florida was a case in point. Florida depends on tank vessels to deliver its fuel, and storm preparations and evacuations deplete fuel supplies. The ports closed during the storms, but when they reopened, in the words of one reporter, a Jones Act armada was waiting to resupply the state with petroleum. Dozens of Jones Act vessels were streaming into Florida ports to help their fellow Americans. Puerto Rico was another example. As you all know, the original story was that the Jones Act was impairing the recovery effort. That was patently false. Thanks to your hearing last October, among other factors, the story quickly changed and the truth came out. The Jones Act fleet was steadily delivering containers to the island, which were stacking up on the terminals due to infrastructure issues inland. The Jones Act fleet was and continues to be a major part of the recovery effort, with almost 80,000 containers delivered to the island so far. Our carriers stepped up to help Puerto Rico, and they remain committed to Puerto Rico for the long term. I'd be remiss if I didn't finish by mentioning our industry's commitment to hiring veterans. When we have jobs to offer, we love for those jobs to be filled with veterans. AMP has run a series of programs to encourage hiring of veterans, and we'll be doing more. AMP has a new Military to Maritime website, militarytomaritime.org, which is a central location where applicants can go to receive information on careers in the maritime industry. I appreciate the opportunity to to represent our industry here today. As we face the challenges ahead and work to see our industry return at least to profitability, if not prosperity, we're grateful that the members of this subcommittee have taken the time to understand our industry, and never was that understanding more important than during the recent hurricanes. With the airways filled with so much misinformation, you helped set the record straight, and we're so grateful for that. Thank you. The American Maritime Partnership stands ready to help as you address the issues related to our industry. We'd be happy to answer any questions now or in the future, and I would request that my written remarks be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered, and our condolences, too, on your promotion to Chairman of AM. Mr. Eblin, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the state of the U.S. flag international fleet. My name is Eric Ebeling, and I am here today on behalf of USA Maritime, a coalition consisting of American vessel owners and operators, trade associations, and maritime labor. As the President and CEO of American Roll-on-Roll-Off Carrier Group, a New Jersey headquartered company, it's my honor to lead an incredibly talented team of men and women at the largest U.S. flag RoRo operator. We own and operate 8 roll-on-roll-off vessels in international trade, all of which are enrolled in the Maritime Security Program. Our newest ships, MV Patriot and MV Liberty, joined the fleet in 2016 and 2017, respectively. All our vessels are crewed by American mariners and fly the American flag. The commitment U.S. carriers make to the national security of the U.S. through programs like the Maritime Security Program, MSP, and ironclad contracts like the Voluntary Intermodal Sealift Agreement, VISA, and the global shipping, intermodal, and logistics services U.S. carriers provide to the Department of Defense are a clear best value buy for the taxpayer. It is well documented that the U.S. government does not have a sufficient organic fleet, nor the intermodal and logistics capabilities to do the job entirely on its own. Studies have shown that it would cost the U.S. government tens of billions of dollars to organically obtain those same ships and services. We have a great industry-government labor partnership with clear and significant advantages, mutual benefit, and we must maintain it, or risk losing the ability to deploy and sustain such asymmetrical logistics advantages. According to MARAD, there are currently 82 non-Jones Act U.S. flag international fleet vessels. Over the last 5 years, the U.S. flag international fleet has decreased by about 25%. Not only do U.S. flag carriers in international trade compete in a hyper-competitive global marketplace, but we are also uniquely sensitive to the ebb and flow of government policymaking, which, when translated to an economic impact on the U.S. flag carriers, can destabilize or support or even turbocharge investment in the U.S. flag international fleet. The two most effective policies that support the U.S. flag international fleet are MSP and the cargo preference laws. MSP is a proven national security program enacted to ensure that the United States has the U.S. flag sealift capability and trained American citizen merchant mariners it needs in time of war or other national emergency. At the ship naming ceremony for ARC's MV Liberty in June 2017, Department of Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao called MSP, quote, a model public-private partnership. At a cost of $300 million per year as currently authorized, the program is an exceptional value for DoD and the taxpayer. But the program is only authorized until 2025, and it is critical that it is extended beyond 2025 as soon as possible. Participating companies must finance the purchase of replacement tonnage, a 30-year asset that may cost up to $80 to $100 million based on a program that expires in a few years and is subject to the annual appropriations process. This could be considered akin to going to your local bank with a proposal to buy a home with a 30-year mortgage, knowing that you only have 1 year of income. Carriers have collectively invested billions of dollars, but for this investment to continue or increase, continued stable funding is vital, and the program must be extended or simply made permanent. Cargoes generated by the cargo preference laws are the key incentive for U.S. flag operators operating in international trade to remain under U.S. registry and are part of Congress's long-established intent to support the privately owned and operated U.S. flag fleet and merchant marine. It's a rather simple equation. Without cargo, carriers will not invest in ships, and without ships, there will not be jobs for merchant mariners. Without those merchant mariners, the government-owned reserve fleet cannot be crewed. To that end, we offer 3 suggestions. First, as the ranking member noted earlier, Congress passed legislation in 2008 to give MARAD stronger cargo preference enforcement tools. Unfortunately, the previous administration did not implement them. Congress should work with the administration to ensure faithful implementation and execution of these laws. Second, under America's cargo preference laws, 100% of all military cargoes and at least half of all civilian agency cargoes must be shipped on U.S. flag vessels. Why not require 100% of all government-owned or financed cargoes to move on U.S. flag ships? Lastly, Ex-Im Bank, the National Export Credit Agency of the U.S., needs a board quorum that can approve new projects. Without an Ex-Im Bank, America has effectively unilaterally disarmed, and while most of the impact has been felt by the American manufacturing base and workforce, there has been an attendant impact to national security in the form of a reduced U.S. flag fleet and reduced manpower pool. The U.S. flag fleet has been at a crossroads in recent years. We now have knowledgeable and supportive leaders at both the Department of Transportation and Secretary Elaine Chao and the Maritime Administration and Administrator Buzz Busby. We also have had steadfast leadership and support from U.S. Transcom and its Commander, General Darren McDew. As General Darren McDew noted in an October 2017 speech, quote, "We don't know when, but someday the nation is going to come calling. When she does, she will need us. She will need our ships. She will need our mariners. If we do nothing now, the strength of the maritime fleet that brought the nation to war throughout history, that strength will not be here. It's already in decline. It's incumbent on all of us as Americans to stay that decline and ensure that this crown jewel capability continues to be available to U.S. Transcom and the nation. And you can help by continuing to support laws and policies like MSP and cargo preference that enhance the fleet. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Evelyn. Mr. Aaron Smith is recognized as the President and CEO of AMSA.
Thank you, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for allowing me time to speak this morning. My name again is Aaron Smith. I'm President and CEO of the Offshore Marine Service Association. I ask for my full remarks to be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. AMSA is the Association of Owners and Operators of U.S. flag vessels engaged in constructing, servicing, and maintaining offshore energy assets on our OCS. In total, we represent 170 member companies, U.S. companies, and their 12,000 employees. We are a strong Jones Act supporter. The first offshore well was drilled 11 miles off the coast of Louisiana in approximately 18 feet of water. Today, instead of 11 miles, projects are routinely done 100 miles from shore, and instead of 18 feet of water, they're done in 10,000 feet of water. This increasingly complex work yields increasingly complex vessels. To keep up, AMSA members modernize and recapitalize their fleets in U.S. shipyards and invest in thousands of highly skilled and compensated U.S. mariners. In turn, these mariners participate in the Ready Reserve Force, and these shipyards build assets for the Navy and Coast Guard. In short, when enforced, the Jones Act works as intended. The prolonged downturn in the worldwide energy markets has greatly impacted AMSA members. As Ranking Member Garamendi alluded to, more than half of AMSA member fleets are currently in cold stack or laid up in the mud. Those that are working at day rates below even OPEX. A recent IHS market survey found that vessels that were commanding a day rate of $40,000 in 2012 are now working for a day rate of between $9,500 and $15,000. However, as Matt alluded to, we're in a cyclical industry. We understand this. These are forces we understand. We've been through downturns before. We understand we'll come out on the other side. So my members get that. They've been there before. The challenges that AMSA members can't understand is understanding why the government fails to enforce the Jones Act. More than the market downturn, this failure degrades the confidence in our industry and pits U.S. vessels against those that do not have to comply with the same tax, labor, or regulatory costs. As you know, current law, as represented by the Jones Act in combination with OCSLA, is simple. It prohibits foreign vessels from picking up cargo at U.S. ports and transporting it to points on the U.S. OCS. Unfortunately, Customs and Border Protection has confused and degraded that clear standard via their issuing of private interpretations of the Jones Act between 1976 and 2009. Many of these letter rulings, as they are known, are directly contrary to the statute and tenet of the Jones Act. In 2009, CBP realized their errors and issued a notice of its intent to revoke many of these flawed letter rulings. That notice was very candid in admitting that these letter rulings are contrary to the intent of the Jones Act, quote. However, after accepting public comments on the revocation notice and at the urging of foreign vessel owners and charterers, CBP punted, saying a new issue would be issued, quote, in the near future. Spurred by this potential enforcement of the Jones Act, AMSA members invested $2 billion in U.S. shipyards, building dozens of state-of-the-art vessels capable of serving the market covered by this revocation notice. But we had to wait 8 years for that, quote, near future to arrive. It finally came 364 days ago when CBP again issued a notice of its intent to revoke these flawed letter rulings. Again, CBP accepted public comments on their notice. Like in 2009, AMSA members and thousands of our employees submitted comments in support, as did 34 members of Congress and 10 senators. I would like to note half of this subcommittee signed those letters. Thank you all. Despite this acknowledgement, second acknowledgement, that CBP itself was not following the law, and despite this public and political support, CBP again decided not to enforce the Jones Act on May 10th, issuing a notice that they were ending their revocation effort. It's clear who benefited from this decision. A London-based trade association for the international competitors of AMSA issued a press release saying that everyone should, quote, celebrate a positive result. AMSA members were not in a celebratory mood. 12 days after CBP stopped their revocation effort, one of my members lost a previously secured lucrative contract on the OCS. That vessel was provided cover by the same letter rulings that CBP had sought to revoke. It leveraged its lack of U.S. tax, labor, and regulatory compliance costs to underbid my member. The problem continues. In September, CBP reversed a $22 million Jones Act penalty. We believe that that penalty was issued under those same letter rulings that they sought to revoke. We believe this to be a strong signal to the international market that the U.S. OCS is open to foreign vessels. Again, the Jones Act has proven time and again that it can provide for our national, homeland, and economic security, but it can only do so when it is properly enforced. I welcome any questions you have, and thank you all again.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Paxson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to provide testimony on the state of the U.S. flag maritime industry. I ask that my entire testimony be submitted for the record. In December 2016, the Navy released a new force structure assessment that called for a fleet of 355 ships. To achieve this buildup, a substantial and sustained investment is required in both procurement and readiness, but our industry stands ready to build and repair this fleet of the future. Also critical to achieving this goal is strong congressional and administrative support of the Jones Act. The Jones Act ensures a commercial shipbuilding industry, supplier chain, and workforce that can support building and maintaining these Navy assets, making it a major national security benefit. It is for this reason that the U.S. Navy has always and continues to support the Jones Act. Long-term, there needs to be a workforce expansion, and some shipyards will need to reconfigure or expand production lines to meet demands for both government and commercial construction. However, the shipbuilding industry, like so many other manufacturing sectors, faces an aging workforce. Attracting and retaining the next generation shipyard worker is critical. Funding, predictability, and sustainability, along with fully and consistently enforcing the Jones Act, will allow industry to invest in facilities and more effectively grow its skilled workforce. Consistent enforcement of the Jones Act is critical. A recent decision by the Department of Homeland Security to not revoke a series of letter rulings that have allowed foreign-built and foreign-crewed offshore supply vessels to operate in violation of the Jones Act has created uncertainty and resulted in numerous new U.S. vessel construction contracts to be canceled. I raise this issue as an example of how a decision by an agency to not properly enforce the Jones Act can adversely impact the entire shipyard industrial base. Shipyard capacity is critical to recapitalize the Coast Guard's desperately needed fleet modernization, including inland waterway vessels, cutters of all sizes, and icebreakers. Almost all of the shipyards that are building Coast Guard vessels also build Jones Act vessels. It is because of this law that the Coast Guard is receiving such robust competition to build its various classes of ship, including the polar icebreaker. As we look at the current state of the U.S. flag maritime industry, we need to ask ourselves, what's next? Recently, our shipyards effectively built for the increased demand in the tanker market due to the oil and gas boom. It is a testament to the Jones Act that the commercial shipbuilding sector mobilized rapidly to meet the market demand and built state-of-the-art tankers for that market. It was a true success for our industry. In addition, our shipyards recently delivered numerous large ocean-going container ships to recapitalize the non-contiguous fleets. Vessel construction for these important shipping routes is ongoing at several shipyards and will be completed in the coming years. A common misconception, however, is that without large vessel construction, the U.S. shipyard industry is dormant. However, nothing could be further from the truth. In 2015, our industry delivered 1,438 Jones Act vessels. And in 2016, we delivered 1,329 vessels. Looking towards the future, we expect there will be strong investment in expanded ferry and passenger vessel services, hopper dredges, commercial fishing fleet recapitalization, and a robust ATB market. We will also need to be ready to build training ships to support our maritime academies and recapitalize the severely aging ready reserve force. As a closing observation, it is important to highlight to this committee that U.S. shipyards do not compete on a level playing field in the worldwide market. For example, last year, South Korea's government injected $2.6 billion into one of their most prominent shipyards in order to keep the yard from going bankrupt. A September report from an international think tank found evidence that shipyard costs in China decreased between 13 and 20% between 2006 and 2012, leading to a substantial misallocation of global production with no significant consumer gains. These are examples of the direct and indirect government subsidies provided by South Korea, Japan, and China that have resulted in shipyards from those countries building for markets that did not exist at rates subsidized by those foreign governments. It is therefore an extreme misrepresentation to compare foreign subsidized shipyard markets to that of the Jones Act. Thank you, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, for allowing me to testify along such distinguished witnesses today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Van Loo, you're recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Bill Van Loo, Secretary-Treasurer of the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association and a third-generation Marine engineer. I am pleased to present testimony on behalf of the MEBA, the American Maritime Officers, the Master Mates and Pilots, and the Seafarers International Union. Combined, our unions represent the men and women who operate U.S.-flagged vessels in both the domestic and international trades, and we continue the patriotic tradition of supporting the military whenever and wherever needed. We are the fourth arm of defense. Despite constant warnings from leaders in the Department of Defense, the pool of mariners has shrunk to a critical level. Without action, the military will no longer be able to rely on the American Merchant Marine. We appreciate the subcommittee's commitment to ensure the existence of a vibrant maritime industry. Since 2011, the U.S. flag international fleet has shrunk from 106 to 82. This should be concerning to every American. In order to change course and reverse the downward trend, we must protect and fully fund existing programs and create new programs and opportunities that will increase the number of U.S. flagged vessels. That effort should start with national maritime policy that ensures a steady stream of cargo, which in turn creates employment opportunities for militarily needed U.S. merchant mariners. By providing a minimum level of cargo, U.S. flag preference shipping requirements are essential to maintaining a strong industry. We strongly urge Congress to restore the U.S. flag share of PL 480 food for peace cargoes to the 75% level that was in place since 1985 until 2012, when it was reduced to a mere 50%. It is no coincidence that the size of the U.S. flag fleet has shrunk by more than 26% as a result. All too often, federal departments and agencies and government contractors have ignored U.S. flag shipping requirements for the carriage of cargoes paid for by the U.S. American taxpayer. Not only are U.S. flagged vessels denied those cargoes, but there is no recourse when it is ultimately determined that the law was violated. We implore Congress and the administration to reinforce to all federal agencies and their contracting officers that cargo preference laws must be adhered to. In 2008, Congress passed the Duncan-Hunter National Defense Act that made it abundantly clear that the Maritime Administration was the final enforcer of cargo preference. Unfortunately, the administration has failed to fully adopt that language, and we must be concerned that the refusal to implement this law indicates an unwillingness to abide by cargo preference laws. Congress should require the administration to fully comply with cargo preference laws. We also recommend that Congress should receive a detailed record of the bills of lading associated with the program. It's very simple. Without cargo, our ships do not sail, and our mariners will not be standing by in times of need. Another key component of American maritime policy is the Maritime Security Program. The MSP is a unique public-private partnership that ensures that the DoD has the Sealift capability and foreign intermodal network it needs while cutting costs. It would cost the government over $65 billion to replicate the capacity provided by the MSP. While government cargoes continue to decline, the MSP allows American ship operators to compete for commercial cargo with vessels that do not comply with our more stringent laws and regulations. We are pleased that Congress recently reaffirmed support for the program by increasing the authorized funding amount. In order to secure the availability of U.S. flagged ships to the American mariners, we ask for your help to secure full appropriations for the program. The export of strategic American energy assets presents an opportunity to increase the size of the fleet and associated employment opportunities. We support the efforts of Congressman Hunter, Garamendi, and Duncan and their legislation to require the exports of strategic energy assets to travel on U.S. flagged vessels. I'm a third-generation merchant mariner, and it is incredibly important to me and the labor organizations that I represent today that this industry is viable for generations to come, not just for the important source of reliable middle-class jobs, but for the vital role that the U.S. Merchant Marine serves to safeguard our country's military, economic, and homeland security. We are encouraged that the administration and Congress seem poised to consider comprehensive infrastructure policy. It is important that renewal of the U.S. Merchant Marine is considered as a part of that discussion. We stand ready to work with you to achieve these objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Leeuwen, and thank you to all of you. I'm going to recognize myself. I guess my first question is this. You've all very eloquently laid out how important the Jones Act is, the benefits of it and the downside to losing it. What do you think is behind, you might even call it a deep state in our own government with CBP and the administration? Why do you think that U.S. officials or U.S. government employees that work for the American people want to get rid of the Jones Act? Why? Why do you think that is? Because yeah, please, go ahead, Mr. Woodruff.
I think they're misguided. I think that they have people who are trying to get an undue advantage over a situation who are trying to tell them things that aren't necessarily true. And, you know, there are a lot of people out there who are trying to make a buck. And they think that they can do so by promoting a false narrative about cost associated.
Let me make my question more explicit then, so you all have a better way to answer it maybe. Why would an American government employee, whether it's CBP or Department of Energy or anything, want to outsource all of the shipping that they do? Meaning, why would they not want Americans to do it? I mean, they're not making money off of energy company X from Great Britain, right? They work for CBP. So why would they want to give preferential treatment to foreign countries over Americans?
I can't imagine.
Any of you, please, help me out here.
Chairman Hunter, I think there's some inherent belief in free trade that the Jones Act is a protectionist statute, and therefore there's a belief that they don't want to enforce this or being guided by an administration that might have some of those.
Do any of you know of any maritime nation, meaning a nation around the world that is on the ocean or that can get to the ocean that do not have cabotage laws? Does one exist? So every maritime nation in the world has a Jones Act, and we're one of them. This isn't, we're not special. Every single maritime nation that I know of, industrialized nation, has cabotage laws. Why do you think people in our government want to give foreign interests preferential treatment over Americans?
I think you stumped them.
I mean, there's got to be a reason. Any of you?
Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Well, we've all laid out what's going on, right? So tell me why.
For CBP's part, in many cases, what I think you saw from 1976 through 2009 was a lack of understanding of our industry. Many of these letter rulings had confusing terms in them that built one upon each other, that talked about when we finally got into CBP and explained what we were doing, they didn't understand that these blowout preventers or wellheads or jumpers or compressors, things that are a quarter of the size of this room, were left on the seafloor. They thought from the rulings they were given or from the letter requests they were given that that was, quote, equipment of the vessel and stayed with the vessel. And it wasn't until we told them that, no, that is left on the OCS for perpetuity, that they understood what was going on. And when they did, they issued the 2009 notice of revocation. And so there is a lack of understanding for some when you receive a request for a ruling to understand what's actually going on.
Thank you. Anybody else want to try at this one? No. Okay. Let's just, I'll just finish up by saying the absurdity of trying to take away America's cabotage laws. The reason that Great Britain was able to conquer the world from a little island is because they had a great Navy. The reason we've been left untouched and didn't have the wars like World War I and II is because we got the Pacific and the Atlantic, so people can't drive tanks across our borders here. In order for us to maintain the way of life as we know it, as a nation that's secure and is able to project power, be it Navy power or commercial power, the Jones Act is intrinsic to that. It is the cornerstone of all of it. And I think you all very eloquently laid out how important it is, but the absurdities of some of those in this Congress and in government to think that you want Korean or Chinese or name your country made ships and taking away the entire American workforce of making ships and driving them and getting something from point A to point B in America, it's almost, it's stupid, it's absurd, and I hope that we just keep educating and educating, because that's what it's going to take, so that people understand what this is and how it is one of the cornerstones of our entire country's national security apparatus. It is the Jones Act, and it is what allows us to project power and be the greatest country in the world. It is the Jones Act. That's one of the cornerstones, and I firmly believe that. Thank you for your testimony. I'm going to yield to the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I couldn't agree with you more on your point about the Jones Act and a cornerstone. Into the details, gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for your testimony, and I want to get into a series of questions that we discussed with Admiral Nadeau, and it has to do with the letters of non-availability. If half of the offshore marine supply and work vessels are laid up, how can there be a non-availability? Mr. Smith.
Yes, sir. I believe the term for the letter is non-applicability, as in OXLA does not apply to that vessel. And what they are being utilized for is, in some cases, yes, those letters, the vessels that have that letters are taking work away from the vessels that my members own and operate. In other cases, those vessels are doing completely legal activities, such as a drill ship or a MODU. Those type of vessels are not transporting merchandise between 2 points on the OCS, and we do not have those vessels. So those vessels have letters of non-applicability, I'm sure, and it would not matter. But there are also foreign supply vessels that have letters of non-applicability that are operating on the OCS, and those are the vessels that are taking work away from U.S.-built, U.S.-crewed, and U.S.-owned vessels.
You said earlier that in your testimony that this dates back to 1976 and a series of letters that have come forward from the CBP, Customs and Border Patrol. Could you, and in your testimony you also discussed efforts that have been made to rectify the inaccuracy in those letters. Could you go into that just a little bit more detail here and lay out for this committee, and specifically what we might be able to do to rectify the situation?
Certainly, sir. So, yes, starting in 1976 was the first letter ruling that we look at dealing with merchandise on the OCS. And that letter dealt with a pipeline barge that was transporting merchandise. From that, it was declared that the laying of that pipeline was not a Jones Act activity. And that's not a point we're challenging right now. I do want to make that clear. But the other activities, the ancillary activities, we're looking at. Now, the CBP revocation effort also kept that pipeline ability in there, but also said you can't transport pipeline connectors, tools, or other materials and leave them on the OCS. Additional letter rulings have been issued for items such as de minimis activities. Basically, as long as you're not breaking the law too much, you can do what you're doing. Or unforeseen repairs was an interesting letter ruling. Someone submitted a letter ruling request for preventative maintenance, and CBP responded and said, no, preventative maintenance is an intrinsically foreseeable activity. Well, the next letter ruling that came in said, well, we have an intrinsically unforeseeable activity. Is that allowed? CBP said yes. We also had some for other similar activities. Hey, we're doing a permitted activity, and while we're doing that permitted activity, we would also like to do an unpermitted activity. Would you allow that? That was also agreed to. So that was kind of the letter rulings that built upon themselves.
I understand that you filed a lawsuit to try to clear up this situation. Is that correct?
Yes, we have, sir.
And that suit is proceeding?
Yes, it is.
What can we do by law, or, well, basically by law, to make clear that there is a differentiation between reasonable activities and unreasonable activities? Is there a lack of clarification in the current law? Does it need to be clarified?
As I said in my testimony, sir, I think OXLA and the Jones Act are very clear. If you're transporting merchandise from point A to point B, that has to be on a U.S.-built, U.S.-crewed vessel.
So it is really about the enforcement of the law.
Yes, it is, sir. And I understand that the committee is going to be having a hearing later this month on that, and I applaud that effort. Thank you all.
Okay, very good. I want to go into another question area, and I'm out of time, so I'll wait till we come back around.
Mr. Weber is recognized.
Gosh, John, you shocked me there. I thought you had 3 or 4 minutes left in you.
Thank you for yielding, and I'll carry on.
Next time. We appreciate you guys being here. I wanted to go back to something the chairman said, and Mr. Chairman, you've been at this a lot longer than I have. You know, you're asking why was that happening, for example, the CBP, and y'all talked about some different ideas. Well, I would submit this, that sometimes in the name of free trade, some of our bureaucrats think we need to be fair. We ought to be fairness. There's a world market out there. Somehow we've got to, be world market oriented and fair about it. But there's nothing fair when you're dealing with a lot of other countries who subsidize and do all the things that we know that they do. So, Duncan, maybe that's the answer to the question. Somehow they have gotten this idea that we need to be fair. We need to be the leader in fairness. Well, I submit that we want our economy to be the best. We need to be fairly in the lead. We want our national security to be best. We need to be fairly in that lead, and that's the fairness we ought to be concerned about. Let me jump over to LNG. I know that many of you may not know that I represent the Gulf Coast of Texas, first 3 counties in Louisiana. The Sabine Neches waterway is currently sending out about 95% of the LNG from our country, okay? So we want to be in the lead, and we want to maintain that as long as we can. So the United States has become a leader in regard to LNG-powered vessels. How can we maintain that position to the benefit of the fleet overall, as well as the safety and security, national security, and the economy of our nation? I'll start with you, Mr. Woodruff.
LNG propulsion, I think, is what you're speaking of, is a great opportunity to bring a cleaner, more environmentally friendly way of running a lot of our vessels, and I think it's just a matter of building out the infrastructure. We have vessels that are LNG capable now in the domestic fleet. The first container ship that was capable of running on LNG in the world was built in America for the American market.
How long ago was that?
It was about a year and a half ago that vessel went into service, thereabouts, and there's many more coming along behind it. Now we're in the process of building out the bunker barges and the other infrastructure necessary, and so I think it's just going to be a matter of time. You have a bit of a chicken and an egg. You need the vessels out there in order to incentivize the building of the bunker vessels. They're under construction now, and so I think it's something you'll see growing over time.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
Congressman, I have one of my members has a dual fuel fleet of OSVs that run on both natural gas and diesel. They have seen some good success with those. It lets the vessels stay out a long time because when you run out of one, you just switch to the other. I'm, of course, oversimplifying it. But they've had some good success with those. If you're ever down in South Louisiana and it's not snowing in South Louisiana, I would invite you to come tour that vessel.
Is it snowing there today?
It looks like it was, yes, sir.
Okay.
U.S. mariners do have experience with LNG, and as LNG evolves and we get more experience, it'll be beneficial for the industry.
Well, we would love to see that coming from our district because that's very, very important to our district. And on the national market, you know, the United States is going to be sending a lot of LNG around the world, and we want to continue that, so everything we can to push that. Let me change gears just a little bit here. Question for each of you. Does the strength of the U.S. flag fleet bolster the credibility of the United States, an international maritime organization, or other international maritime organizations? And if you think that it does, how so? We'll start down here on this end, Mr. Van Loo.
Absolutely. Strength in numbers. The more U.S. flags we have on the international worldwide, the stronger the U.S. will look in the IMO and all the other international organizations.
And I'll let you each go, and then I've got a follow-up question, Mr. Paxton.
Yes, sir. I think what you look at it, if you look at our domestic fleet of 40,000 vessels waving the U.S. flag, we're the envy of the world. I think that's why you see so many foreign operators trying
That
to...
actually is part of my second question. Let me interrupt you. How close does who's the second country to that? We have 40,000. Who's second?
Well, because of the Jones Act, we have 40,000 vessels that operate under the U.S. flag in our waterways.
I mean, would you be privy to the information? China, how many vessels they
I
have?
was going to go to my next point, which is you often hear reports of Australia lamenting the fact that they don't have a similar cabotage law, and they'll have foreign operators run aground and hurt Australians and folks on those vessels. We don't have that problem here, and so I think that's the power of the U.S. flag, and it's also the power of a national security asset to have those vessels plying the waters.
And we want to maintain that, Mr. Smith.
Yes, Congressman. AMSA has sent delegations to the IMO in most years in recent memory, and I know we have individuals going to the IMO within the next month. We look forward to that, and I know we are well respected and well received there. Because of the strength of our maritime industry and because of not only its number, but our technological capabilities and how, especially in our industry, we have led the world in developing these vessel types and capabilities.
Okay, Mr. Ebling.
Thank you. Yes, the chairman mentioned actually the Jones Act as being one of the cornerstones, and you're
Absolutely
mentioning that as well. I would argue that there are actually three cornerstones, or a three-legged stool, if you will. It's the Jones Act, which obviously is essential, but also MSP, the Maritime Security Program, and the Cargo Preference Laws. All three are essential to national security and economic security, and the strength of each leads us to having a stronger representation at the international level, including the Coast Guard being able to represent us at the IMO level as strongly as they do. So thank you for the question.
Mr. Woodruff.
As the domestic fleet, we don't deal with IMO. We answer to you, who answer in turn to the American people, and we think that's the way it should stay. We don't think that the IMO should be telling us how to move cargo within America.
Sure, but y'all would all agree that the fact that we've got 40,000 flagged vessels is probably a pretty good arrow in our quiver when it comes to national or international security. Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Lowenthal, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank all the panelists for being here. My question is for Mr. Smith. As you've pointed out, that last spring, the CBP reversed its notice on the application of the Jones Act to oil field operations on the Outer Continental Shelf. That notice would have reversed, as you pointed out, a series of misguided rulings and would clarify that subsea construction and other activities do fall under the Jones Act requirement. And also from your testimony, and also from an analysis from your association, you've identified over $2 billion in investments to construct or retrofit 31 vessels to service these operations with Jones Act compliant ships. And that this shipbuilding activity occurred between CBP's announcement in 2009 that it would revoke the flawed interpretations of the Jones Act regarding undersea operations and the new notice in 2017. So that, with that as a frame, I want to ask you 4 questions, each one separately. My first question is, after this notice was revoked by the administration, what is the current status of these newly built or retrofitted vessels? And I'll ask you the other questions after you.
Certainly. Thank you, sir. For these dozens of vessels referred to as multi-purpose support vessels, or MPSVs, they are doing different things. Some are still on contract and engaged with different operators and different charters. They are capable of doing this work. They can beat any international vessel in doing this work, so they do get employed. Others are on government contracts and are doing services for NOAA or MSC or other government agencies. But the majority of them are currently at the dock.
So they're sitting idle?
Yes, sir, they're sitting idle. Now, there are vessels that are, last I looked, there are, let's call it circa 5 to 10 foreign MPSVs in the Gulf right now, taking work away from a Jones Act qualified vessel. So there are some of that. That is down from historical averages because of the downturn. But even outside of the downturn, we have, as you mentioned, built enough to cover capacity.
So you have. So you've already answered my second question. So some have been shifted to other operations, oil operations or other duties, and some are sitting idle. So the question I'm asking you is, was this a waste of $2 billion? What do your members think? Did they waste this money now?
I certainly would hope they wouldn't think of it as a waste, because we have a government agency which has twice said that they are not following the law. Sooner or later, that is going, I believe, to prove us right, to prove that we have been right. So these vessels have a long lifespan and will be utilized. Additionally, and maybe it's a very small victory, but by building these vessels, we have recapitalized some of Mr. Paxton's shipyards here, which have then enabled those shipyards to participate in some very big government projects. And again, I think that in itself proves that the Jones Act works as intended. And I'm not saying that's worth $2 billion, but I do think that shows something.
All right, so let's say, as you say, you're assuming that at some point we will do the right thing, and CBP will change its interpretation and come back to the rightful interpretation that the Jones Act does cover this. So the question is, if that occurs, what economic benefits do you think this proper enforcement of the Jones Act will have for your members? How will this impact your members if what you're saying is ultimately the CBP understands and makes the right interpretation? How will this impact your members?
I think it will definitely provide an economic benefit for our members. But more than that, I would look at what it would provide for our nation. And looking at that, my organization hired a domestic economist here from within the United States, and that economist found that correct interpretation of the Jones Act by CBP would create 3,200 new jobs in the United States, would put $700 million into the United States economy, and would create wages of $155 million increase. That is, of course, in addition to the 500,000 men and women in this country that are already employed due to the Jones Act.
So what you're saying is if there was a correct interpretation of the Jones Act by the CBP, we truly would make America great again. Thank you, and I yield back.
Amen. I'd like to close here by yielding to the ranking member, Mr. Garamendi.
I'll try to do this quickly. Mr. Weber appropriately raised the question of the export of a strategic national asset, natural gas and LNG. It's estimated that just 10 years from now that they'll take about 140 ships to export the potential LNG that is available in the United States for foreign trade. If just 5% of that were an American-built ships, we're talking some 7 ships. Probably 4, maybe 5 would have to be built in the meantime. Similarly, on crude oil, by 2028, if just 5% of the crude oil were to be shipped on American-built ships, we're talking some 12 ships. So if we were to require, as we once did with the North Slope of Alaska, that all of that oil be on American-built ships, but let's not be greedy, let's just say 5%, we could substantially increase the number of ships built in America by a significant number, maybe half a dozen by 2028 in LNG, maybe a little less. Crude oil, probably in the range of 12 to 15 ships in just 10 years, giving new life to the commercial shipbuilding industry in the United States. Now, the fact that we're proposing a piece of legislation that would do that brings me to the question to Mr. Paxton. Can you do it? Is it possible that we could actually build commercial LNG ships for the international trade as well as crude oil in that range over the next decade?
Well, first, I want to say thank you very much, Congressman Garamendi,
Microphone.
for the work you've been doing on this. Your staff has been excellent. I appreciate your time spent with a lot of my members working on really hard legislation. But yes, the answer is we could meet that demand. Again, we still want to build that 355-ship Navy, but truly building commercial vessels for LNG and crude export is what we did with the North Slope. I mean, that was part of the deal. And so if we could have some configuration of that again, you know, I know you've been working with my trade association for a long time on this. We want to get it right. We want it to be defensible, and we want to, you know, fight for it along with this committee and with you, sir. But yes, the answer is yes, we could do that. I would say on LNG, as you know, sir, that's a very complex vessel. We haven't built those in a little while now, but based on my members and what I've been told, we could gear that up in time with timelines that we've seen in some proposals that you've been working on.
I thank you. Mr. Van Loo, are the Mariners available over that period of time?
That is a concern, because as the industry continues to decline, we're going to lose more mariners. So hopefully we have bottomed out, flatlined, and we will be able to supply the mariners if it stays consistent or if we can grow a little bit. It's tough to recruit when you're talking to young people about an industry that's not doing very well.
Well, our goal is to make sure this industry remains strong. For the benefit of the committee members here, we will soon be bringing to all of our attention a piece of legislation that I think will have support from the shipbuilding industry as well as the mariners, and probably not the petroleum industry, but 5%, 10%, they could do it. They could live with that. With that, Mr. Chairman, you have a hard stop at 12 o'clock, so I will yield back my remaining 1 minute and
Thank the gentleman. There are no further questions. I want to thank all of you just for all that you do, all the time and effort you put in, and for doing something that's more important than just business. I mean, this is, like we talked about, a national security cornerstone and an economic cornerstone of this nation. So thank you very much for all that you do. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.